Thank you for watching the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe. If you can support the museum, please think of backing us on Patreon or joining one of our membership schemes. Or if you watch to the end of this video, you'll be able to see how you can help the museum by buying items from our online shop. This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle here beside me, the EE-9 Cascavel armoured car made in Brazil in the 70s and 1980s. And it's an interesting story because it's a bit of a different one than the usual East versus West or wartime production of armoured vehicles. And we're going to look at parts of why that's interesting and this slightly different type of development that went on to lead to this Cascavel armoured car, and we'll also be touching on another vehicle, the EE-11, which was called the Urutu, and both of those vehicles were sort of built in parallel. Now, if we go back to just after the Second World War, Brazil has a defence alliance, as it were, with the United States, and the USA has given Brazil a number of armoured vehicles, including M8 Greyhound armoured cars. Now, those vehicles are in use with the Brazilian army, but by the mid-1960s, they're starting to show signs of wear and tear and they're getting a bit outdated. And America at this point has concentrated its efforts in Southeast Asia. It's starting to get heavily involved in Vietnam, and the more modern equipment that it might have as surplus, it's got other homes to go to, less important or more important, as it were, than Brazil. So Brazil, this ties in with an issue that was going on at the time, which is a lot of countries back then at the time, if you read all the articles, they were often called third world countries. We'd probably say developing countries now. But at the time it was, how much should countries rely on other nations for military equipment, and how much should Brazil as a country build up its own indigenous industries and make things within the country? So the M8 Greyhound was a good example of this, where first of all, Brazil starts looking at, can we remanufacture parts for the vehicle within our own country, or, as arguments which were in the press at the time, should they go towards building up their own indigenous actual capability of making armoured vehicles? Now, this is where we come to a point where a company called Engesa gets involved. They were originally a civil engineering company. They did some four-wheel drive vehicles, and their director, who, forgive me, my Portuguese is not brilliant, but I believe his name said Jose Ribeiro, he ends up putting together designs for a potential improvement of the M8 Greyhound, and then he comes up with basically a new vehicle. He works on that. By 1970, he's got the Cascavel and the Urutu, which is going to be the requirement for the Brazilian Marines, and the Brazilian Army they're thinking about they might need an armoured personnel carrier. He's got these two drawings, got to the point where they can actually build a prototype. And with help from the Brazilian military, help from other industries around the world, what comes to fruition is the Cascavel, the EE-9, built by Engesa, and the Urutu, an armoured personnel carrier. We have one in the collection here, box-like structure, initially amphibious, six-wheel drive on both of them, and they use a common engine and drivetrain. So there's that commonality of parts. And where Engesa were clever is they have particularly tried to go for components that they knew the potential purchasers would be able to get access to on the open market. So when I first came here many moons ago, this vehicle, they were trying to work to get it going, and it was explained to me that basically the engine in this is basically, it was a Mercedes bus engine was running this. So that idea that they knew that Mercedes had sold engines all around the world, component parts were therefore going to be readily available. So things that they'd thought of that way, but they'd also come up with, very original, very clever, they'd come up with a laminate armour system, 2 layers of metal, one harder than the other, that was put together about 16mm, and that gave a higher level of protection than a single layer of rolled homogeneous steel. So that was quite clever, and that was going to go on the vehicle that way. And again, they went for, where they could, simplicity. It had an interesting, on the rear two axles, a suspension system that was called the boomerang system that gave it really good off-road capabilities. But they aimed as well, key thing, cheapness. One of these vehicles was costing at the time about $500,000, about $500,000, and comparatively, that was cheap compared to equivalent vehicles on the marketplace. And in some areas, what comes out with a Cascavel is actually a vehicle that's actually superior to some of the others on the marketplace at the time. Now, in 1972, the prototypes are accepted. The Brazilian Army, actually the Brazilian Marines only order about a dozen of the Urutu, the armoured personnel carrier. The Brazilian Army actually orders 200 of them, so they go into production. They're looking at the Cascavel, they like the idea of the Cascavel. The first model of the Cascavel has the turrets taken off from the M8 Greyhound and just dropped on the new chassis. At the same time as that's being offered to the Brazilian military, Cascavel also, Engesa also take a model of the Cascavel and they take it on tour to some of the defence shows, and for that one they've actually got a turret off an AML French armoured car with a 90mm gun in, and they put that on the top, and that attracts foreign interest. And Qatar originally puts in an order for 20 of these vehicles. 1975, the next moment, Abu Dhabi actually puts in an order. 200 are ordered from Libya, along with 200 of the Urutus as well. Iraq, sorry. So what you're getting is a serious number of foreign orders coming together that actually propels the vehicle forward in terms of its own production. And at the time, they put aside, Chile, for example, orders 25, they put aside the manufacture of vehicles for the Brazilian army to concentrate on these foreign orders. And this is, again, one of these interesting areas where how does a country build military vehicles where their own market might be too small to sustain that company? So the foreign sales were essential to Engesa to actually build up a market. And they were in the market at just about the right time as well, because by buying from Engesa in Brazil, countries could almost avoid falling into the trap of seeming to side whether it was the communist Eastern Bloc or the capitalist Western Bloc. They could buy from a country that seemed non-aligned in a way. And that certainly worked, and also Engesa as well with countries like Chile where it's selling to. Very few other countries were prepared to sell to Chile at the time because of the political conditions there, whereas again Engesa didn't feel that was a problem. So what happens is there's some initial early sales, some big orders. Engesa carries on improving the Cascavel. Cascavel, by the way, rattlesnake. All the vehicles they're making are named after venomous South American or Brazilian snakes, so Urutu is another one. So Cascavel goes through a number of models with a number of improvements. After the major order from Libya, they end up putting a new gun on the turret, redesign the turret, and the new gun is built by Engesa under license. It's a 90mm low pressure gun that is actually the Cockerel gun built in Belgium. They manufacture it under license in Brazil. They call it the EC-90, and this is the Mark V Engesa next to me. This has that gun on it, and it can fire 3 different ammunition types. It can fire heat, it can fire HESH, and it can fire high explosive. So in other words, it doesn't need all the extra build standard to fire a armor-piercing round at high velocity, but it will do a similar amount of damage if it needs to. And again, one of the reasons it's being bought by not only South America, it's bought heavily into the Middle East, it's bought into Africa, it's actually even bought out in the Far East, out in Burma, they buy some as well. Because again, it's simple, it's affordable, it can be maintained, that's what they're looking at. And also from the point of view as well, not every country needs to have the top end specification for all out warfighting. In other words, for a lot of the sorts of engagements the Army is likely to be involved in, this is going to be good enough for the roles it's going to take. So again, it fills that marketplace where not everybody needs to have the latest bit of absolute cutting edge technology. Now, this Engesa, the Mark V, this particular Cascavel one here next to me, this one will have carried about 44 rounds of the ammunition for that EC-90 guns. It can go at about just over 60 miles an hour on the open road, about 750 kilometers range, so that's a good range for this. It's got all 6-wheel drive, and by this time, again, each model is going through various improvements, and some of them are rebuilt in the factories to improve them to the next standard. This one has got a tyre inflation system that could be controlled by the driver. Driver's in the front, you can see his hatch over the top there. 2 other crew members in the turret, so you've got a commander and a gunner on this one. And it would normally fix a 7.62 machine gun next to the main armament, and often a mounting there you can see for something like a 50 caliber machine gun as well. And these vehicles see a considerable amount of action all around the world. Now, some of those engagements we know about. So, for example, they were fighting in the Iran-Iraq war, they fight in the Gulf War. About 30 of these vehicles were later actually done up by American forces after the invasion of Iraq, because they ended up being reissued back out to the new Iraqi army. So they're still in service today out there, having been tidied up a bit. And a number of countries still have these in service, frontline service. About 28 countries ended up buying this vehicle. So, you know, a lot of them went out there. About 1,700 of these vehicles have actually been built, along with about 1,000 extra Urutus. So that's a considerable number when you think about it, that are spread around the world. Now, I mentioned about looking at the marks. One of the things when the company Engesa are looking at improving the firepower on the vehicle, one of our ex-trustees here, Richard Ogorkiewicz, he actually went out to Brazil and on a number of occasions looked at what they're doing, and he writes up his impressions at the time when Engesa are actually starting to produce the Cascavel and the Urutu. And he's impressed for a number of reasons. Number one, as a private company, they were very progressive in getting things done quickly. And you'll see this when they go on to actually make a tank, potentially for the Brazilian army. They tout it for sale as well, the Osario, which it goes to Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia are looking at the Challenger 1, they're looking at the Abrams and Leopard as well. And that tank performs superbly, but it's actually put together in about 2 years. Obviously other manufacturers helping out, Vickers were involved, etc. But Richard Ogorkiewicz was very impressed by the way that Engesa were able to push things forward at a rate that in certainly the Western nations, to a certain degree Soviet Union as well, you know, this was so much quicker. And part of that reasoning was they didn't have all the processes to go to of approval from the military, change of specifications going on all the time. So that was one thing he was particularly impressed by. Another thing he does is he actually brings the president of Engesa back over to the UK. He takes it to him to Elvis, and they look at the Saladin turret with a 76mm gun on it as a potential to be able to drop on to the Cascavel hull. At the time they were looking at trying to replace all the AML-90 turret, trying to look at something that might do better on there. And there was even a rather hybrid vehicle from a Cascavel and an Urutu. They were put together in the sense of the turret was taken off a Cascavel, put on top of the Urutu armoured personnel carrier, and that in 1980 was offered to the Americans as part of a program they were looking at an air-portable, lightweight, 6-wheel vehicle. It didn't actually make the sales there, but the FMC Corporation of America bought rights onto the Cascavel in case they were going to be made in the future in America. Now, sadly for the Brazilians, the Engesa as a company, it invested lots of money in the new main battle tank they hoped was going to be built and bought by the Brazilian army. Doesn't happen. There's no actual orders for that, and Saudi Arabia decides to go for the M1 tank instead off the Americans. And in 1993, Engesa becomes bankrupt. Other companies are looking at or continue the maintenance and the upgrades of these Cascavel armoured cars. So from the point of view, it's a bit of a different story. It shows how armoured vehicles can be made in a different sort of setting, but it also shows some of the problems of any defence company making an armoured vehicle, especially it's that idea of the marketplace. You know, being able to sell over 2,700 vehicles around the world is a really major achievement, But the fact, as soon as that market dries up, the industry, as it were, it just couldn't be sustained on just upgrade programs, etc. One of the downsides, therefore, of defence industries always is small production runs and the vagaries of the marketplace. Sometimes you put a product in the marketplace, there's a lot of countries looking. Other times a very good product can be put out there. But if no one's buying at that particular time, or there's no money, there's no seem to desire or need, you're not going to get anywhere. So our Engesa, this particular one I mentioned, the Mark V, is not actually a runner at the moment. Very nice of us to be able to have it in the collection. It was actually gifted by Engesa to the Tank Museum back in the 1980s, so we're very pleased to have it. Our Urutu was one of the ones captured during the Gulf War, brought back for evaluation off of the Iraqi army, brought back here for evaluation, and it's now part of the collection down here at Bovington.
We have a fantastic selection of books, models, clothes and other gifts on the Tank Museum online shop. When you buy from our online shop, you are supporting the Tank Museum charity, and that means we can carry on caring for our collection and producing this content. If you have supported us already, thank you very much, subscribe and do keep watching.